Great. Welcome to another edition of the Virtual Time series seminars. It's a great pleasure to have Christian Wolf from MIT. Should I do a short presentation? Christian is recently hired at MIT and he finished his PhD. You're what we call the pandemic generation, right? So you finished almost at as the pandemic was unfolding, right?
Exactly. I still had an in-person job market and everything, yeah. From
Princeton. So given the conditions, you have done very well for yourself, and we are very eager to see your presentation. It's of course on combining in the context of our virtual time series seminars is combining time series with identification, with a very important issue. It's a great pleasure also to welcome our panelist, Christian Matthes, who's going to help us coordinate things as well. The floor is yours, Christian. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for having me give this talk here. So this is a paper about time series regressions and policy, in particular policy rule counterfactuals, and it's joined with Alistair McKay at the Minneapolis Fed. So very broadly, the question we're trying to tackle in this paper is figure out the extent to which we can use a very long empirical literature that tries to identify the causal effects of policy shocks. So think about the traditional VAR or the local projection literature on monetary policy shocks, fiscal policy shocks, and so on, to learn about the effects of changes in systematic policy rules. So to give a concrete example, suppose you know how an oil shock propagated under the actual policy conduct of the Fed, and then you want to figure out how would it if propagated under, say, nominal GDP targeting. Now, the way kind of typically one of the main ways the literature typically uses these kind of causal effects of identified policy shocks to tackle counterfactual questions like this is to say, let me first estimate those policy shock causal effects. Let me then build a fully specified parametric micro-founded structural equilibrium model of the macroeconomy, make sure that model is consistent with my empirical evidence on shock propagation, and then trust that model as an artificial laboratory to answer all kinds of policy counterfactual questions I'm interested in. That's, that broad strategy is something that Larry Cristiano and co-authors in their 1999 handbook chapter refer to as the Lucas program. And the appeal of this approach is very obvious. Because you're committing yourself to a particular micro-founded structural model, you're going to be, by construction, invariant to the kind of classical Lucas critique related concerns. On the other hand, the similarly obvious downside is that, again, because you're committing yourself to a particular parametric model, you are going to be vulnerable to model misspecification. Where we're going to come in is, so I'll try to convince you under certain assumptions on which I will be very explicit, and also on the limitations of those assumptions, I'll be very explicit. It is in principle possible to construct valid systematic policy rule counterfactuals, and by valid, I mean in particular consistent with the Lucas critique, that only relies on empirical evidence on the propagation of identified policy shocks without needing to commit yourself to any particular parametric structural underlying model. So in more detail, the first part of the paper, and clearly the heart of the paper, and also the heart of my talk today, will be an identification result. So I'll give you a set of conditions under which the impulse responses, and here's now going to be the key twist, to multiple distinct identified policy shocks. I'll be precise on what I mean by multiple distinct. For a kind of quick preview, think on monetary policy side, both something like a short-run transitory innovation to interest rates, as well as more a forward guidance-y type shock. Combining those, and under the assumptions that I'll state, we will be able to construct answers to questions like the one at the top of the slide, construct policy rule counterfactuals in a way that is, as I said, robust to Lucas critique related concerns. Out of this theoretical identification result, whose information requirements are going to be quite high, as you'll see, I will then present an empirical method, an actually implementable empirical method, in which the researcher starts by estimating the causal effects of distinct policy shocks, and I'll be very careful and explicit on why I think this is actually something we can do in applied practice. And then these policy shocks will be combined in a particular way to approximate as well as possible the counterfactual that you're interested in. And I'll showcase at the end of the talk a specific application that leverages the kind of canonical identified monetary policy shocks of Roma and Gertler-Corradi to predict the counterfactual propagation of investment demand type shocks and the various counterfactual possible monetary policy rules. So that on this one slide is what we're doing, and that's also the structure of the talk. So again, I'll spend like probably 3/4 or something on the identification result, and then the end will be on the empirical method and application. Any questions at this point about where I'm going? If not, then I'll just jump right in. And before hitting you with kind of all of the equations that are going into the identification result, I first want to very kind of, I hope, cleanly communicate the core intuition using just a bunch of numerical experiments. So I'll begin with a visual illustration. In the background of this visual illustration, you should think of, there is some, for now, underlying structural model that I've used to generate data. Okay, so of course, at the end of the day, my identification result and my empirical method will not, of course, rely, as I've claimed in this first slide, on any underlying structural model. But now I'm just using a model as a laboratory to kind of communicate the intuition, the workings of the identification result. So think of the underlying model, say, if you want to, as your favorite linearized DSGE type model, something like Matthes, for example. Now, let's suppose this model is subject to a cost push shock. And in this model, the rule that the monetary authority is actually following is this green rule down here, a vanilla, simple as possible Taylor type rule, mapping inflation back to nominal rates. The shock we're looking at is a contractionary cost push shock. Oh, and I think there's a, oh, that's just if people want to unmute. Yeah, so if you have questions, just unmute yourself, jump in, interrupt me at any point. Okay, so this economy is subject to a cost push shock. It's a contractionary cost push shock. As usual, very unsurprising, that cost push shock will lower output, it will increase inflation. Here I'm showing the output impulse response. Now let's say we want to know what would have happened in the same economy after the same cost push shock if the Fed had instead followed a different rule. And here I'm just giving you one example, this orange rule down here. It's a different kind of Taylor rule. And let's say that one is also going to respond to output. So it's going to be a little bit more of a dovish rule overall. If the Fed follows that, and I knew all of the equations of my model, and I were to resolve it, I would get the orange line here. Output would drop by less initially, follow a kind of hump shape, and then go back. Okay, so far so unspectacular. The question I want to answer is, what information would an econometrician that I would stick into this economy and that could estimate various kinds of VARs, local projections in that economy, what information would she need to know to correctly predict the orange line, the counterfactual of interest? Now let me begin by revisiting an existing and well-established econometric methodology, that of Chris Sims and Tao Jia, coming out of work they've done in the 1990s and then followed up in a string of papers also in the 2000s. Essentially, what they're saying is we have an econometrician that knows two things. Number one, of course, the econometrician knows the green line. She knows what happened after the cost push shock under the original prevailing monetary policy rule. Clearly something estimable using a VAR or a local projection. Number two, let's say this econometrician can also get impulse responses, so the causal effects of a conventional monetary policy shock to the baseline policy rule, the rule that generated all data she's observing. So the econometrician knows the causal effects of this blue guy here, the new TM shock, the conventional monetary policy shock. If she had that knowledge, then she could follow the following kind of argument and construct the following possible counterfactual. She could say, let me begin at date 0, when the initial shock hit, the cost push shock, and let me find a monetary policy shock at date 0, new 0M, such that at date 0, nominal interest rates, inflation, and output in response to both the original cost push shock, the green guy, as well as the monetary policy shock I'm adding at date 0, are related as dictated by the counterfactual rule that you're interested in, the orange rule. That's one equation and one unknown. So I'm showing here, if you solve this, the policy shock you need is this dot down here. It's some negative number. Why negative? Because that's an expansionary monetary policy shock. The new rule is more dovish than the old one. Okay, you solve for this, and then you figure out what does output do in response to the original cost push shock plus this additional monetary shock you've solved for. Well, you get one number. It's this blue dot here. Okay, let's continue this iteratively. We can do the same thing then at date 1. Add another monetary policy shock such that at date 1, the counterfactual policy rule holds. So again, one equation, one unknown. This is the number you solve for. Then you get a second output number at date 1. You can just continue doing this across all dates. And this is what you're going to get. you're going to get a sequence of monetary policy shocks, nu 0M, nu 1M, nu 2M, and so on. This sequence of monetary policy shocks is such that along the equilibrium transition path that you've constructed, the counterfactual rule you're interested in holds exactly. This gives you an output path, and the output path that you've constructed in this way is the blue dashed line here. Comparing the blue dashed line and the orange line, you see that something is amiss, right? What you want to construct is the orange line. What your approach that you've taken here gives you is the blue dashed line. They're not the same. There's a very simple economic intuition for what's going on, why these are not the same. If you think through kind of individual households, individual firms who are populating the model that's underlying everything I'm doing here, they're thinking at date 0, hey, there's this cost push shock that has hit the economy. And today there was a monetary policy shock such that actually this counterfactual rule, the orange rule, is holding. But tomorrow we're going to be back to our old prevailing rule, the one that sets IT equal to phi pi times pi t. That's what they're thinking. But then at date 1, they get surprised again. There's another monetary policy shock. So actually the counterfactual rule holds. At day 2, they get surprised again. At day 3, they get surprised again. Okay, so they get repeatedly surprised. Once you take this point of view and you realize this is one of the potential shortcomings of this construction here, you realize there's one potential avenue to fix this. Suppose our econometrician knew more. She also knew the causal effects, not just of a conventional contemporaneous one-off monetary policy shock, nu 0M, but also a one period ahead monetary policy shock, so a forward guidance shock. The interpretation is she knows at date 0 or at date t, say that the conventional baseline monetary rule won't hold exactly at date t plus 1 or at date t plus 2. There's going to be a deviation from this. Okay. If you knew the causal effects of such distinct contemporaneous as well as news monetary shocks, then you can start, you have more degrees of freedom. You don't just need to set those monetary shocks to enforce the counterfactual rule in equilibrium ex post. You can also start to match the counterfactual in expectation. In particular, if you had access to n distinct shocks, then you could say I can match the counterfactual ex post, just like in the one shock case, plus an ex ante expectation for the next n-1 time periods. Okay. So now again, for each date now you're solving n equations and n unknowns, and you keep on doing this iteratively forward. Here's the result from me doing that if I have 2 policy shocks. So the first 2. I want you guys to notice 2 things in this figure. Number 1, here on the right-hand side or in the middle panel, we now have 2 panels, a sequence of the contemporaneous as well as the one period ahead policy shock innovation. Number 2, very loosely speaking, relative to the previous figure, we're now kind of getting more action from the shocks at date 0 and less action from these ex post shocks that we need at dates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. We need less ex post surprises, though we still need some of them. Third observation, at least here in this particular numerical example, the blue dashed line seems to be closer to the orange line. So we seem to be getting closer to the actual systematic policy rule counterfactual of interest. Now, what would happen if I continued this with more and more shocks? You'll see the 2 patterns I just described just continue. You're going to be enforcing the new rule more and more with date 0 shocks and less with ex post surprises. And you're going to be getting closer and closer to the counterfactual that you're interested in. In particular, here's going to be the limiting result. If I have lots and lots of shocks, I will be enforcing the counterfactual rule not at all with any ex post date 1, date 2, date 3 realizations of shocks. I will do everything at date 0 with date 0 versions of my contemporaneous and forward guidance shocks. That's what you see here. And if I'm doing that, then it turns out I'm getting the correct counterfactual. So the economics of this, or what we're seeing here, is we're now at least sidestepping this one kind of obvious concern with the one shock version from before. We're not just ex post in equilibrium enforcing the counterfactual rule, we're also doing it ex ante in expectation. And at least in the particular underlying structural model, and of course I didn't describe to you guys, this was just to build intuition, at least in this environment, this seems to have been the entirety of the bite of the Lucas critique. So once we accounted for those expectational effects, at least in whatever that environment was, we seem to be getting the correct counterfactual. Now, our identification result, and the formal identification result that I'll sketch now over the next couple of slides, is exactly trying to figure out what makes this logic tick, across what space of structural macroeconomic models does this actually work? When does it break down? And once we've hopefully convinced ourselves that this is still a result that will survive in a meaningfully large family of structural models people would in general like to entertain, once we've done that, we can go ahead with an empirical method. And because clearly, as you see here, the information requirements seem to be huge, right? I'm leveraging many, many distinct monetary policy shocks to enforce my counterfactual. So again, first we need to convince ourselves this is a reasonably general result and understand where it's coming from, first step. And then second step will be how can we actually operationalize this? So that'll be the remainder of my talk. Any questions at this point about the broad intuition?
A quick clarification. So
Yeah.
here on the middle figure, it looks like the all shocks are at 0, but that's because they're announced at 0, and then one is going to kick in one period, the other one in 2 periods, and so on, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Just
yep.
clarification. Thanks.
Exactly. Yep.
So,
And yep.
Question. This is Tao Zha, very interesting.
Hey, Tao.
Hey, so just one conceptual questions. And so I guess, I mean, this is very nice. You had a lot of shocks in here and then uncover this counterfactual. And would that be equivalent by adding more lags, variables, or something like that? Would that do the similar things? I don't know if you guys have tried that. So that's a question one. Question two is that in terms of the rule has been changed, typically in those DSG model, it probably is going to reflect it on the, if you think about it, if there is a VAR counterpart of the DSG model, it'll probably will be reflected in the A0 is changed.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So I just wonder that, if you can do the A0 is changing, how that will, affect your algorithm and so on. So those are two conceptual, questions I have.
Yes, perfect. So I actually think that those are going to be going to go or connect more neatly to the actual empirical implementation later on, but let me nevertheless give kind of a quick preview of a response. So kind of adding more lags, in particular, if I'm understanding you right there, I would say, so the way I kind of started to think about it more is, so you somehow isolate causal quasi-exogenous variation in the conduct of monetary policy. Lags that I would be including would just be kind of either about estimation efficiency, or by having enough controls, which is what these lags would amount to, making my identification arguments more plausible. So to me, this is just something you would need to decide to get credibly at one shock, but I don't think you can, with the same identifying assumptions, just change the number of lags and say, this is now suddenly giving me a different shock. So I think that would not be a credible strategy in my view, even though in any finite sample, as you're changing the number of lags, you may be getting slightly different policy shock paths. But I think this would be more of a finite sample issue rather than something that's really part of your structural identifying assumptions. Second part on your A0, that point is incredibly well taken. And this will relate also to something I'm describing in the theory now, because essentially what I'm going to say is, in terms of structural models in their state space representation, or in terms of induced VARs, in terms of their A0, as I'm changing policy rules, the A0 or the ABCD of the state space representation will be changing. Those are kind of the famous Hansen-Sargent cross equation restrictions. Right. When I develop my identification result here, I will begin with a more primitive representation of the model before solving it out. And so before mapping into the A0 of the VAR or the ABCD of the DSGE. And at my more primitive level, I will have one block of the model that's going to be invariant to the policy rule. That's exactly what we're going to get into now. And
I see.
That will be the core assumption. And then we can also start talking about models that do not admit this separation. Many models will. Some models will not. And I think that's actually a fun part of this paper, that we can discuss in what model directions will we need to go to break what you guys just saw here visually on the slides.
Nice. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let me now jump into the general environment. And this will So the notation will look a little bit foreign, which is why I will very slowly develop it, and also through various examples map into specific structural models you may be familiar with. The reason why I'm going to be choosing this notation is precisely relative to the VAR or DSGE-based notation we just talked about. It's easier to see, you know, these Hansen-Sargent cross-equation restrictions versus my exclusion restrictions in this way of writing the equilibrium. So let me state precisely what I'm writing here, and then I'll give you guys an example to kind of see exactly what this notation means. So the model with respect to which I'll be stating and proving my identification result is the following. It's going to be consisting of two model blocks. The first block of which is something I'll refer to as the private sector block of the economy. That's equation 1. And the second block is what I refer to as the policy rule. That's equation 2. Okay. So first of all, let me begin by saying this system here is written in what is now kind of in structural macro known as sequence space notation, or equivalently, it's written in impulse response space. So solutions to a system like this will be impulse response functions to structural shocks. Let me now elaborate a little bit more. So whenever you see a boldface in here, so the boldface X, Z, or epsilon, that will denote time paths. Okay, so if X was a single variable, then boldface X would be in the paper, in the formal result, a sequence. Here, it would just be a T by 1 vector. So finite T just for expositional simplicity for the purposes of this talk. So now we're going to have these two equations. The first equation will relate the various variables in X, and those are going to be private sector variables. Think of that: employment, inflation, consumption, investment, and so on, kind of canonical models, variables of the structural macro environments we think about. Number 2, it will be a variables collected in a vector Z. Those will be policy instruments. In my canonical implementation or application, this will be the nominal interest rate. But you can also think of this as, say, government purchases, stimulus checks sent to households, the generosity of unemployment benefits, and so on. So these will be the two sets of variables: private sector X, non-private sector Z, so policy variables Z. And then there will be two sets of shocks, epsilon. This will be a set of non-policy shocks, the shocks with respect to which I want to construct a counterfactual, so like the oil price shock from before in my numerical illustration. And then the orange term, nu, those will be my policy shocks. Okay, so that's the broad outline. Let me now give you a specific example of a model you all know that will fit into this overall structure of equations 1 and 2, and hopefully make this notation a little bit clearer. This simple example is going to be the 3-equation New Keynesian model. So we all know that model. It has an IS curve, it has a New Keynesian Phillips curve, and it has a monetary policy rule. How can I write a model like this in my kind of fancy matrix notation up there? Well, let me begin with the first equation, the IS curve. That's just going to be at each date 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a relationship between output today. Those are the ones along the main diagonal of this matrix here, and output tomorrow. That's the right-hand side term in our usual Euler equation. And those two things, the growth in output or growth in consumption, is going to be related to the real rate of interest scaled by the EIS. What's that? It's just so 1 over gamma times the nominal interest rate. So there's just an identity matrix here. It's I0, I1, I2, I3, and so on. As well as inflation 1 period ahead. Okay, so that's why here in this matrix, you have a bunch of ones, one off the main diagonal. So all I'm doing here is I've stacked the usual Euler equation now in my perfect four-side impulse response space or sequence space representation. This Euler equation, it's an equation that needs to hold in my perfect four-side equilibrium up there at date 0, at date 1, at date 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And my matrices up there are just stacking everything. Okay. So in this 3-equation New Keynesian model, the variables X, the non-policy variables, will just be output and inflation. The policy variable will be the nominal interest rate I. And here's one part of my equation 1, which is the IS curve. The second natural one is the New Keynesian Phillips curve. What does that do? Again, stacking everything in my matrix notation. It relates inflation at each date t to beta times inflation tomorrow at date t plus 1, to kappa times output, the slope of the New Keynesian Phillips curve, And then let me say the NKPC is the one that is subject to a shock. So here now I'm adding my cost push wedge epsilon 0. And let me say that follows an AR1 type representation. So I have a wedge of 1 at date 0, a wedge of rho at date 1, rho squared at date 2, and so on. Okay. So all I've done now is from the kind of usual New Keynesian model that we usually all write down in a state space representation, I've now just written everything in perfect foresight stacked representation, where I've just repeated all of those equations for all dates from 0 to infinity. Okay. And then I have my third equation, the monetary policy rule. Let me just pick a very simple example, a canonical Taylor rule relating nominal rates today at each date to phi times inflation. That's the conventional part. And now let me talk about the key part that I will need for my identification, the orange guys here, the new vector of policy shocks. You see, that is again, exactly as in my example, this combination of a contemporaneous monetary policy shock, that's nu 0, the wedge in the rule at date 0 that was announced at date 0, but then it's also a bunch of future wedges, nu 1, nu 2, nu 3. Those are all of these news shocks. It's a shock announced at date 0 that will lead us to deviate from the rule at date 1, at date 2, at date 3, and so on. Okay? Is that at this point clear how at least a simple 3-equation New Keynesian model I could write in my general representation of equations 1 and 2 up there? Are there any questions at this point? Okay, I'm assuming I'm being clear.
Just clarifying, right? So Z here, Z is really I in your example.
Z is I, exactly.
Y is X, right?
Y and pi is X, exactly, and Z is I. Yep. Yep. Perfect. Yeah. More generally, as long as you're looking at a linearized representation of structural models, I mean, note very clearly my equations 1 and 2 up there are linear. As long as you look at something linearized, your favorite kind of Kittlin-Prescott original RBC, reasonably like medium scale New Keynesian DSGEs like Smets-Wouters, Cristiano, Eichenbaum, Evans, and so on. Even recent Hank type models, like say the Hank model of the original AER paper of Kaplan-Violante, once you linearize that in macroeconomic aggregates, they all, as we work out in detail in the paper, admit representations like our equations 1 and 2 up there. For New Keynesian DSGs, this probably shouldn't come as a big surprise to anyone who's worked with those. Just you have a bunch of equations, right? You have investment demand equations, you have labor supply relationships, you have various policy equations. They're all linear. Once you stack them in my perfect foresight representation, you just get huge matrices all out of that, much more complicated than the one in my 3-equation NK model. But nevertheless, you can write down those matrices in closed form. In Hank, we cannot get these matrices in closed form, but they nevertheless exist and we can compute them. That's a main point of a recent Econometrica paper by Adrian Auclair and co-authors. So again, Hank type models, heterogeneous firm type models like Kahn-Thomas, Ottonello-Winberry, all of those, once linearized in macroeconomic aggregates, would admit a representation like my equations 1 and 2 up there. So what's not nested, or rather, what makes my identification result later on, which will apply to this kind of environment, what makes that tick? Well, there are 2 features I already at this point want to draw your attention to. Look at the private sector equation, the private sector block 1, and look at how policy decisions affect private sector behavior through the lens of this equation. The only thing that is entering the private sector block of the model from the policy side is the value of the policy instrument, the current and future value of the policy instrument Z. In English, this just means something like households and firms care about the extent to which they care about what the Fed is doing is how interest rates, what kind of interest rates they are facing today and expecting to face in the future. They do not intrinsically care what kind of policy rule generated the sequence of interest rates they're facing. They don't care if the interest rates are high because the Fed is following a really hawkish rule or because a really dovish rule is subject to hawkish shocks. They only care about what is the sequence of rates we're facing, okay? That's a meaningful restriction on the environment and a restriction that we'll return to later on. Not all models people like structural macroeconomists have written down will satisfy this feature. And I'll have a fair amount of discussion on this. But for now, I just want you guys to note this is something that's embedded in my way of writing the equilibrium with these equations 1 and 2. Second thing is, of course, this is a linear system of equations. As a result of linearity, everything is going to be invariant to signs of shocks, sizes of shocks, the underlying state of the economy, and so on. That's something I'll also return to towards the end. It actually turns out to not be a conceptual limitation of my identification result. I will be able to generalize everything towards a nonlinear environment, but it will be a practical limitation. For practical intents and purposes, if you want to implement our method, you kind of need to assume an underlying linear environment. These kind of higher order things of sign, size, states mattering, in principle, fine. Given the constraints that actual time series data is imposing on us, I don't think we have a hope of going in that direction. So that's something I'll return to towards the end. For now, I just want you guys to notice those 2 key features. And if we're on board with those, then I'll just state now the kind of precise steps that go into my identification result. Then I'll state the result, and then we can discuss scope and limitations.
Quick clarification.
Yep.
Clarification question. So when the central bank announced that it's gonna increase interest rate in 5 years, nothing happens before 5 years, because Z will actually change in 5 years. Or I might be wrong. So
No,
how do we think about these new shock? Does a new shock affect people's behavior today, given that it's not going to affect interest rate?
Yeah, but that is in this environment completely allowed, right? It could be so households are seeing the restriction is that it's only the time path of interest rates they're expecting to face.
Yeah, it's true. So Z is a vector.
That will govern their behavior, but they could very well respond to something that's happening 5 periods from now.
Okay, thanks.
And in fact, if they did not respond to anything in the future, if they were purely myopic, then you wouldn't need all of this multi-shock construction, because then you only need the contemporaneous shock.
Yeah.
Like news will only matter once it realizes, but that's not a feature of the usual models we write down. So that's these expectation effects, but these will turn out to be the only game in town.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, good. So now given this environment, an equilibrium is going to be a bounded sequence of X's and Z's that, given bounded sequences of shocks, given bounded epsilons and u's, solves my system 1 and 2. I will assume that under the baseline rule, the baseline policy rule, the AX and AZ that generated the data that my econometrician will observe, an equilibrium will exist and is unique. Okay, that will be an assumption I'm maintaining throughout. In a slight abuse of notation, I will write the causal effects of the shock, of the non-policy shock epsilon under that baseline rule as X of epsilon and Z of epsilon. Why slight abuse of notation? Well, because this corresponds to epsilon being equal to that sequence and nu being equal to 0, which means the old rule, the purple rule here, is followed perfectly. Okay. My question of interest, my object of interest is now, I would like to know the impulse responses of X and Z to this non-policy, say, cost push shock epsilon under the alternative counterfactual policy rule, AX tilde, AZ tilde. So this is kind of my question from the beginning. How would, say, an oil shock propagate under nominal GDP targeting rather than under whatever the Fed was doing in the actual sample we're observing? Okay. So let me now have one slide stating my information requirements and then a second slide stating the identification result and giving the intuition for it. So here's the information that we will need. To state that information, I just need one additional step. Under my assumptions, this linear system of equations, here I'm just kind of heuristically solving it, given that I have a finite horizon t. This is all fine. These are just matrices. These are not linear operators because I'm not dealing with proper sequences. So here I'm just saying you just invert the thing. Everything is going to work in the usual way because this is just classical linear algebra. Everything is finite dimensional. So once I've solved the model, what's the solution of the model? It's a mapping from epsilons, the non-policy shock, as well as the policy shock nu, into my outcomes of interest, the X's and the Z's. That's just, it's a matrix theta that maps the epsilons and the nu's into my outcomes of interest. And let me just denote the entries of that matrix as theta X and theta Z sub epsilon and sub nu, corresponding to the causal effects of the non-policy shock epsilon and the policy shock nu, or the policy shocks nu. So what's the information that my econometrician will need to predict these objects of interest, the x tildes and the z tildes? She will need to know two things. The first thing is uncontroversial, and it's the easy part. She will need to know, what did this non-policy shock epsilon do under the baseline rule? She needs to know x of epsilon, z of epsilon. That was the green line in my initial numerical illustration. That's something one-dimensional, right? You just need to observe this initial shock, figure out what it did under the original policy rule. That's something a single VAR or a single local projection could give you. The second part is the controversial part of our information requirements, the kind of high hurdle. We say that our econometrician needs to know the causal effects of current as well as all possible news shocks new to the baseline rule. So she needs to know all individual columns of these theta x nu and theta z nu matrices. So the first column is just the impulse responses of the contemporaneous shock, nu 0. The second column is the one period ahead news shock, nu 1, nu 2, nu 3, and so on. She doesn't just need to know some weighted average of these columns, which is what one VAR, one local projection gives you. She needs to know all of these causal effects separately. Okay, so she needs to know the entirety of the matrices. An individual VAR, an individual local projection that you've run to identify an oil price shock, say, or a monetary policy shock, or a fiscal policy shock, will give you, yes, this original non-policy shock of interest, but then only averages of the columns of the orange thetas. Not all columns separately, just averages of those. So we're going to have very high information requirements, and that'll be a challenge once we take our identification result to data. But for now, I just want to state the identification result. This is what we'll need, all of those causal effects. Okay, good. If we have those causal effects, then we can construct in the environment that I've sketched to you guys, the counterfactual of interest. So here's the precise result. Let's consider any alternative policy rule, AX tilde and AZ tilde, a different Taylor rule, nominal GDP targeting, kind of whatever else you want to come up with on the monetary policy side, strict output gap targeting, strict inflation targeting. Suppose additionally that this counterfactual rule induces a unique equilibrium, just like our baseline rule. Then those counterfactuals x tilde of epsilon and z tilde of epsilon are uniquely defined. And you can recover those through the following construction that is fully implementable using empirical evidence on policy shocks alone. What you need to do is look at the original non-policy shock epsilon, and then add a sequence of monetary policy shocks, of policy shocks in general, nu tilde, such that this additional sequence of policy shocks satisfies the following equation. What's this equation? Look first of all here on the left-hand side on the term in brackets. This term in brackets is the impulse response of x, of these non-policy variables, to the original non-policy shock epsilon under the baseline rule, x of epsilon, something our econometrician knows, plus the impulse response of these x's to the policy shocks that I'm going to be choosing, nu tilde, okay? So this is what x does in response to my mix of the non-policy shock epsilon and my policy shocks that I'll be choosing, nu tilde. I'm saying here, this impulse response of x times ax tilde, which is the matrix that characterizes the new policy rule, plus az tilde times the impulse response of z to the same menu of policy shocks, needs to equal 0 at all points in time. In English, what the math here is saying is, I'm selecting a bunch of policy shocks nu tilde, such that the counterfactual rule that I want to contemplate holds in response to my mix of non-policy and policy shocks epsilon and nu tilde. Note that this is an equation for any nu tilde that my econometrician could evaluate. She knows ax tilde and az tilde by construction. That's the counterfactual rules she's interested in. She knows x of epsilon and z of epsilon. That's my first information requirement. And she knows these big matrices, theta x nu and theta z nu. So now if we say just have a one-dimensional policy instrument, like the nominal interest rate, then what we have here is t equations and t unknowns. We need to set the interest rates to values at all individual t time periods, such that the counterfactual rule holds at date 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. That's exactly the construction that I showed you guys visually in my simple example at the beginning. The reason why, if you solve this thing, you recover nu tilde, and then you figure out the impulse responses to nu tilde and epsilon. The reason why this gives you the correct counterfactual is the economics of feature one of my model. The private sector only cares about the current and expected future values of the policy instrument, of nominal rates. What I'm implicitly doing in this key equation here is I'm just selecting a bunch of policy shocks such that the policy instrument today and in the future will move exactly so that the private sector expects the counterfactual rule to hold at date zero and an expectation at all future dates. And as it turns out, in this environment, this is the only bite of the Lucas critique. Once you match policy instrument paths in that way, there is no further room for you to get things wrong. You're going to get the correct counterfactual. That's the core identification result of the paper. And in the paper, and what I would talk about in a longer presentation, is we give similar constructions for other kinds of counterfactual exercises you may be interested in. Suppose you don't want to learn about a counterfactual for a specific oil shock, but you just want to know what would have happened in, I don't know, in the early 80s if Volcker had tightened somewhat less quickly, a particular historical scenario. You can use, there's an analogous identification result. Suppose you want to know what would be the variance, covariance of output, inflation, consumption on average if you followed a different policy rule. You can also construct that. You can even, if I'm giving you a loss function, something like say a dual mandate objective function, you can even for that particular loss function construct the optimal policy rule. All of those counterfactuals work for the same reason I just gave you. The only thing we need to know is how do sequences of policy instruments map into sequences of outcomes, output, inflation, consumption, and so on. Sorry, and that's in principle something that through time series analysis of the dynamic causal effects of policy shocks, we as econometricians can learn about. Okay, so that's kind of the core promise here of the identification result. Before I then talk about how to actually leverage this in practice, because I hope at this point you're thinking, well, these theta matrices are huge. How can I ever learn about all of them? How can I operationalize this? I first do want to give you guys a flavor of the limitations and the stringency of the assumptions that are going into the identification result. So that's what kind of this next slide, my kind of big picture discussion is supposed to communicate. And I think there's a question.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I wanted actually to ask something. A couple of slides ago, when you set your key assumptions. Okay, so you have this generic setting. Just so I understand better, right? I mean, you obviously have a very specific example in mind, which is monetary policy. The instrument is univariate and so on. The policy instrument, but what happens now? The non-policy shock is epsilon, and it has this matrix H of epsilon. What about the V here? If it's multivariate, do you also assume that you are able to perfectly identify the shock of interest versus other shocks? What happens there? And I'm also assuming that all these matrices A of X, A of Z, they're all observed without error, right?
H of,
presumably.
No, I mean
A of X still.
So A of X, actually the original policy rule that generated the data, as it turns out, you do not need that at all. That is never relevant in my, like you can also see in kind of the constructive line in the main proposition, that was never using A of X and A of Z. The intuition for why you're not needing this is all you need is, so in actual data, a policy shock generated some sequence. In my example of nominal interest rates, that's all you need to observe. That's all you need to know. You don't need, like it doesn't matter whether this interest rate sequence was generated in deviation from rule 1 or a different rule within a different shock. If those two rules induce the same sequence of nominal interest rates, they will necessarily induce the same sequences of output, consumption, everything in the private sector, up to equilibrium selection. And the paper actually has a lot of discussion on equilibrium uniqueness that I didn't want to get into for this talk because I didn't think that was kind of quite a fit overall. We could talk about this later on if you're interested. But so that was my first, to the second part of your question. The AXs and AZs do not need to be observable. What would you need if you weren't in this univariate example of, say, monetary policy? Suppose we're now on the fiscal policy side, and let's say there's the natural instrument that would be aggregate government purchases, something, right? So in that case, what you would need is you would need the causal effects of a one-off government purchase today, as well as a sequence of more gradual government purchases, where the government is gradually expanding its purchases over time. And again, you would need to know all of these distinct shocks. Now, if you're then thinking about jointly changing fiscal rules as well as monetary rules, so then this block here has both a monetary rule in it and a fiscal rule, then these orange theta guys here just become higher dimensional, right? So then for each outcome variable X, we now have a T by T impulse response matrix for policy instrument 1, a T by T matrix for policy instrument 2, and so on. So these information requirements then just also are going to grow one by one in the number of policy instruments you're going to be contemplating. Okay, thank you. Yep, perfect.
Just
yep.
One clarifying question. I guess if you identified it, and then you are free to change shocks, right? The size of the shocks or anything in the sign of the shocks to do the counterfactual, right? That's just okay. Because this could be interesting is that maybe the rule didn't change, right? Because just like right now, it just, Fed probably wants to over tightening or, under tightening, right? You can do, okay.
Yeah, and then exactly would be then saying here, okay, if I want to contemplate this particular counterfactual, which is not then for a specific change in rule, but just some temporary over tightening, again, the logic here would be telling you all you'd want to do is match that sequence of interest rates that the Fed would be announcing,
right?
Deviation from its usual rule. That's what you'd want to implement. But the key is you'd want to implement it in expectation going ahead rather than kind of re-surprising with a sequence of shocks. Okay. And
got it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk a couple of minutes about how general this result is and also in particular when it breaks down. And then I'll spend my last 10 minutes on how you actually implement all of this in practice. So the first point I want to make is kind of on the key conceptual restriction that we cannot relax whenever we, even in the more generalized versions of the identification result in the paper, is this sufficiency of the policy instrument, that the only relevant thing for private sector outcomes are current and expected future values in the linear case of the policy instrument, or in the nonlinear case that I'll talk about in a second, the kind of entire distribution of future values of the policy instrument. That is not necessarily the case. The most well-known notable example of a model that breaks this is the kind of canonical Lucas Island economy, in which the monetary policy rule matters above and beyond the actually realized nominal demand growth that the monetary authority is implementing. Why is that? Well, because the firms in this model are solving a signal extraction problem, and the common gain of that signal extraction problem depends on the underlying rule. In my linear model notation, this is something like, if you were to change the rule, my HX and HZ matrices would be changing. That's not the case in many of the models you write down, but it is the case whenever there's kind of a non-trivial signal extraction problem going on. So that's the first important limitation I want to mention. The second thing is on my second assumption, the linearity. There I want to mention at this point, this is conceptually just convenient for me to describe things, but not essential. It's convenient because it allows me to reduce the measurement problem to T dimensions, to just talk about paths and not talk about distributions. In the paper, we have the analogous discussion with full distributions. Of course, that's kind of cheap for me to say. I can generalize all of the math, but is it going to be empirically implementable? And there I'd say, no, you're going to see already now, just in the linear case, it's going to be difficult to implement these things in practice. So I think this extension here is conceptually illuminating, which is why we've included in the paper, but not particularly practically relevant. As a result, because you will, for practical purposes, still need to impose this linearity assumption, I would think whenever you're applying the method that comes out of our identification result, there are certain kinds of rule counterfactuals for which you can use our method and certain kinds of counterfactuals for which you can't. Switching from say, a Taylor rule to nominal GDP targeting or strict inflation targeting all around a given inflation target, I think is fine. Changing, say, the long-run inflation target is not fine, because that's going to be changing the system's steady state, the point of expansion of my linear representation. And then you may be changing these matrices, HX, HZ, and so on. So you should be like, that imposes a limitation of for what kinds of counterfactual questions can this semi-structural or at least non-parametric approach that does not rely on any parametric structural models, when can you apply this? Well, you need to have these two kinds of limitations in mind. So at this point, my kind of overall takeaway on the promise and limitations of the results is that for kind of a canonical set of linearized business cycle models that central banks, practitioners, academics still use very regularly for systematic policy rule counterfactuals, what we're identifying here is a very robust in kind of the public finance use of the word set of sufficient statistics for policy rule counterfactuals, conditional on you knowing what a rich enough set of policy shocks does to the various outcomes of interest. All of these models have no further freedom to disagree on the systematic policy rule counterfactuals they will deliver, be it RBC, 3-equation NK model, quantitative New Keynesian DSGE, Hank heterogeneous firm, whatever you want. Okay, so that to me is the promise of the theory of the identification result. So now what I want to spend again my last perfect 10 minutes on is question, okay, so how do you actually implement this in practice? What are the steps you have to follow as a practitioner to figure out a certain counterfactual that you're interested in? And I want to kind of communicate this by starting with a very simple example. Suppose you do the first step. You estimate, say, the effects of a cost push shock in actual data. And what you're observing is, in response to the cost push shock, say the oil price shock you've seen, inflation goes up and the Fed is leaning against that. So here are just two lines. I mean, I've completely made them up. This is just to illustrate the idea. In response to that cost push shock, in my made up numbers, inflation goes up and the Fed leans against that. Nominal rates go up for some time period and then return back to trend. Now, suppose you'd want to figure out what would have happened to inflation if there hadn't been a monetary reaction, if the Fed had just throughout kept its interest rate at steady state. What does the theory tell us you would need to find? What you need to find, so what you need to do is you need to go to the monetary policy shock literature. You need to open Valerie Ramey's handbook chapter and see that the various structural shocks she goes through that people have identified, and see, do you find a shock, a monetary shock, that moves interest rates in exactly the same way in terms of the entire time profile as what you observed the Fed doing after the cost push shock? Okay, so here to begin, I'm showing you this idealized case where I was able to find such a shock miraculously. In response to that shock, interest rates do exactly what I want them to do. They follow the exactly same time path as they do in response to the cost push shock. And after this particular policy shock, inflation goes down. Okay, so it's a textbook contractionary monetary policy shock. If miraculously you're able to find such a monetary policy shock, then through the lens of our identification result, you're done. Under the assumption of my kind of very general linear encompassing model, all you need to do is say, let me take this line here, subtracting from that, you get your zero interest rate response, which is what you want. That's your counterfactual of interest. Do the same subtraction for inflation. And what do you get? This orange line here. Inflation would have increased by more and more persistently. And the key appeal of the identification result is you now know immediately, if you build any structural model consistent with our assumptions, and that matches the green lines here in the left panel and the policy shock lines in the middle panel, without solving the model, you know the systematic policy rule counterfactual it'll spit out is this one here. There is no room for the model to disagree with that counterfactual. Final point, and this will now map into how we're doing things actually in practice. What happens if you weren't able to miraculously find this perfect shock? Well, first, obvious observation. Suppose you had a combination of two sets of shocks. So one shock giving you this dashed line here, the other monetary shock giving you the solid line here. And let's say a linear combination of those two gives you mimics the green line perfectly. So gives you, you can use that to offset the interest rate movement that you want to offset. In that case, if you have two shocks, fine. Then just add the linear combination of those two shocks to this stuff here. You will again perfectly remove the nominal rate movement, and you will necessarily get the same counterfactual as before. Because again, it's only the interest rate sequence that matters. So what do we actually say in the paper as our empirical proposed method? Our idea is you look for the menu of different identified policy shocks, say monetary or fiscal policy shocks that are out there, and enforce the counterfactual rule that you're interested in as well as possible in kind of a simple least square sense that I'll be making, like stating in a slide or two. But crucially, using only these date zero policy shocks. You never ex post surprise the economy. You just use date zero shocks and see how close you can get. And by construction, this will result in you being fully robust to Lucas' critique concerns. So then the only remaining question is, do you do a good job in terms of implementing the counterfactual you're interested in? And by empirical example, I'll show you guys, well, sometimes you do a good job. That's a counterfactual we can already answer using our state of empirical knowledge. Other counterfactuals we can construct. So we'll need more empirical work or more structural work. So I want to spend my last 5 minutes just illustrating this. Okay. So here's kind of just my very quick overview of what the precise method is. I'm going to say I'm an econometrician that observes a couple of distinct policy shocks, n, not one, not infinitely many. They now give me the small impulse response matrices omega. Those are subsets of my theta matrices from before. Question is, what can you do with those? Well, remember the equation from before. With the full theta matrix, we could perfectly enforce the counterfactual rule. Now we can't do it perfectly, but we can see how well we can do by solving this very simple minimization problem. Try to find the mix of these state zero identified shocks to implement the counterfactual rule as well as possible. Sometimes you'll be able to do it quite well. Sometimes you will not be. If you can, then that's a counterfactual you can construct. Okay, so that's our kind of headline proposed method. In the first step, identify distinct, say, monetary policy shocks, and then try to enforce your counterfactual as well as you can. See if you do it well, report the results. Okay, so 4 minutes left. So let me just give you that quick application to monetary policy rule counterfactuals, and then I'll wrap up. So here's kind of our view on the empirical monetary policy shock literature. From this talk, one thing I hope you've taken away, I mean, it shouldn't be revolutionary, is that monetary policy is inherently multidimensional. It moves the entire yield curve, current and expected future short rates. Once we take that perspective, it's not surprising that the various kind of pieces of causal monetary policy variation people have identified will tend to pick up different kinds of shocks, some more at the short end of the yield curve, some more at the long end of the yield curve. Through the lens of our theory, that's exactly what you need. You want some transitory shocks, you want some persistent shocks that move the longer end of the yield curve. I'll be using as concrete examples the Roma-Roma shock, which is a very short-run transitory innovation to nominal rates, and the Goettler-Karady shock, which moves more 1- and 2-year rates. So in terms of short rates, it's a more gradual, persistent, forward guidance-y type innovation. So I'll just take 2 shocks and their causal effects, and I'll try to see how much can I do with those 2 shocks. That's now my application, okay? So that's what I'll showcase here. My question is, how would investment demand shocks, one of the main shocks analyzed in the kind of applied time series macroeconometric literature, propagate under different alternative monetary policy rules? So what are my information requirements? The original shock. For that, I follow Benzeyev and Kahn, figure out like their shock measure. That gives me what a contractionary innovation to investment technology does to output, inflation, interest rates, and so on. Then I go to my favorite monetary policy papers. I go to Roma-Roma, Goettler-Karady, construct their monetary policy measures. Combining those two, I will try to enforce various counterfactual rules as well as I can. And here are just a couple of examples. So this original shock, it's a contractionary investment demand shock. It leads to, contractionary investment demand shock. It leads to output dropping. It's a negative shock. Inflation goes somewhat up because it has a cost push shock component to it. And in our sample, the monetary authority accommodated that. Interest rates were dropping. Now, let's suppose you wanted to figure out what would have happened for a central bank that cares much more about the output gap. Okay, so that try to implement strict output gap targeting, which is like what we'd want to do is we want to stabilize the output gap as well as possible. Here's our counterfactual. Using our interest rate paths, the best thing you could have done is cut interest rates in this way, much more meaningfully. This would have almost perfectly stabilized output from a year on out. So kind of given the long lags of monetary policy, that's the best you can realistically hope for. The cost of this is persistently elevated inflation. And here we're saying whatever underlying model you want to build and you want to figure out an output gap targeting counterfactual, these are the results you're going to get. if you are consistent with the Roma and Gertler-Corradi shock estimates. Okay, so that's just one example, one application. The paper has a lot more, but I'm running out of time. So I'd rather leave you with kind of my big picture thoughts on why I think the identification result itself and the empirical method, why they matter. So the key idea is that the impulse responses to identified policy shocks are, in the sense I've made precise, sufficient statistics for systematic policy root counterfactuals. The first way to use this is for certain kinds of counterfactuals. This allows you to already construct counterfactuals that are, at least across a large family of models, fully robust to Lucas critique-related concerns. Second point, all of this may still be somewhat theory ahead of measurement, in the sense that what I'm emphasizing here is that knowing the causal effects of many distinct paths of policy instruments, say of nominal interest rates or of government spending, would be very useful. In light of this, I think it's counterproductive if the literature says, I've identified a monetary policy shock and then just looks at peak interest rate responses over peak output responses. Time paths are very useful, and in particular, the expectational effects they're embedding are the only bite of the Lucas critique across a large family of structural models. And so I'd welcome more applied work that exactly looks in this direction of what are the implied instrument paths, and take those very seriously and try to get more disjoint paths to construct more counterfactuals. All right, that's all I have. Thank you so much for your questions and for attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask two quick questions?
Sure, go for it.